got any marijuana to sell? And when a student said sure, that person be charged with a felony drug offense. What do you think would happen? And so think about that. Can you imagine any of you in this room, undercover police going to a college campus here and trying to get people to sell marijuana? And can you imagine those same students being charged with felony drug cases? What do you think would happen?
Outcry.
Outcry, you better believe it. And so what was interesting to me is that that reporter asked me that question. And I think she asked it because we're talking about young Black men actually on the street. And just because it was illegal, it was okay for police to walk up to those young Black men. But we all know that we all actually know that white people use drugs more often than Black people. But who is criminalized? That ends up being the question. It has been, we know the answer to that in the decades past. So I want to thank all of the people that came to be on the panel and you, because I think this is going to be a great beginning discussion about what the new cannabis laws mean. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. I am going to start with Lately. Lately, as the campaign manager for and Minnesota is Ready, which is the largest coalition of organizations and individuals that advocated for cannabis legalization at the state in this past year. Can you speak to some of the policy problems that motivated your diverse group of stakeholders to support this important policy change?
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with all of you today. So, what motivated the folks that were involved in our coalition to fight for this issue, which Minnesota has actually one of the longest traditions of grassroots advocacy against prohibition and in support of legalization. Dates back to the 60s in the state where we've had leadership on that. But really, what has brought it to a head in recent years and where the support came from is that recognition that cannabis prohibition has been an abject failure, in meeting every single one of its public policy goals, except for the racist ones. The only thing that prohibition has done, it has not kept people from using cannabis, it has not kept children from accessing cannabis, it has kept people from using cannabis and getting on the roads. But really what it has done is have devastating disproportionate impact for people in communities of color. ACLU has studied this repeatedly in Minnesota, despite virtually identical rates of usage between Black and white Minnesotans. If you are a Black Minnesotan, you're 3 to 8 times as likely to be arrested or otherwise come into interaction with the criminal justice system for cannabis than if you were white. And these things have significant societal impacts downstream, or even a simple possession misdemeanor on your record can disenfranchise you from being able to get a student loan, from being able to secure housing, can cause problems with custody. It can create all sorts of issues. And so there was this recognition that we really needed to, of course, end prohibition, but that's not sufficient. We've seen other states legalize, and the only outcome is that white people with a lot of capital are then able to make money off of cannabis, while poor Black people still go to jail for marijuana. And so we wanted to make sure that in addition to pushing for legalization, that we were really pushing for a framework for legalization in Minnesota to not only prioritize as expansive as we could expungement of criminal records, but also ensuring those that had suffered the consequences of the war on drug and prohibition are able to participate in the marketplace and do so with priority.
the one mic is gonna be a challenge. Thank you all for your patience. Representative Frazier, as a legislator who worked to pass this particular piece of legislation that we're all talking about, what were some of the concerns folks brought to you about the policy change, and how were you able to work with them to address those concerns in this particular piece of legislation?
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thanks everybody for being here. I will say, this is my second term, and when I ran my first term, it was with the thought that we would have the opportunity to legalize cannabis. And a lot of that, my background, I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and so the war on drugs was terrible for my community. It took a lot of people out of their homes. It ended a lot of dreams for folks that had very great potential and talent to get out of the community that I was born and raised in. So for me, it was very personal in terms of how we could remedy or change or reverse the tide of a war that really has not really just that has had such disproportionate impact, and particularly on Black and brown communities, something that we wanted to see change. And I thought, hey, if I can get elected, I would have an opportunity to be a part of that change. And what I will say is, because this battle started, this charge started long before I got to the state of Minnesota, long before I was born. I mean, that tells you something right there. Long before I was born, this fight was going on to legalize cannabis, to turn back the disproportionate impacts that were happening. So I can tell you as a legislator, because of my role, I heard issues from both sides. I heard issues from folks that were concerned about changing the policy to legalizing cannabis, concerns about how is it going to impact young people? How is it going to impact when I go and sit in a restaurant? Now I'm going to have to smell the aroma of burning flower, right? Those kind of comments, but also from folks that were impacted by this war on drugs, that were impacted by the criminalization of marijuana and cannabis. Those folks wanted to make sure that we went as far as we could go to actually put them in a position to put them on a trajectory to do better now, put them in a position where they wouldn't have the collateral damage that comes along with convictions for being in possession of marijuana or using cannabis. And so with that in mind, we went about the work, and we had the fortune of looking at all the other states that had already passed the law. So we had a chance to look at what was working best for them, but also look at what best practices are, looking at the work that the coalition has done and the recommendations that are provided by the coalition to put things in place. And what I mean by that is to make sure we were expunging records at the misdemeanor level. Those records are going to be expunged automatically for folks that had records at misdemeanor level for cannabis possession. We also looked at how we could deal with the felony level crimes as well. So we created a process where it's going to be case by case, but we're going to take a look at those and either expunge those records or reclassify them at a lower level. Mary can talk a little bit more about that later. But also the social equity piece was one of the most intriguing pieces for me, one of the most important pieces, I believe, of this legislation. How do we ensure that folks that have been impacted by this law for all these decades, how do we ensure that those individuals not only have an opportunity to move forward from this, but have an opportunity to participate in this industry that we're about to create? And what was said earlier is that it's going to be big money. And we want to make sure people can have the opportunity to participate, that have been impacted, participate in a way that will change their lives for the better, in ways that will change generations after them for the better. So we have a real big focus on the social equity piece. We put about $14 million in grants to create, $14 million appropriated to create revolving loans or to create grants for folks to be able to learn about the business, have the capital to actually start up and get in the business. And we're going to continue to work on that. I think there's more to do, but I think this is a great start. I think we went as far as we could with the legislators that we have in place to get this forward. I was so happy that we were able to get it passed now, and I'm looking forward as we're ramping up over the next 24 months, 18 months, 18 to 24 months, and we're going to give those first licenses. We're going to start to see some of the dispensaries and the shops start to open. I'm looking forward to that, and we're going to be very vigilant about ensuring that that social equity piece is and comes to fruition.
Thank you, Representative. Maybe as a law enforcement leader who also supports legalization, what impact do you think this change will have on public policy or public safety?
Thank you. I think it will be positive. Representative Frazier mentioned something called collateral consequences. which is an interesting thing. The courts look at those as those things that happen to you when you are convicted of something that are indirect consequence. And the courts have traditionally not really taken those very seriously. It's like, well, we focus on the conviction. We don't really look at what that conviction might cause. But here's what it causes. If you are convicted of a drug crime, whatever level, you may not be able to get housing. You may not be able to get a job or the job that you want. You may not be able to get a license to participate in certain careers. And so when we think about all of the things that are taken away by these collateral consequences, which are above and beyond, having a conviction, being on probation, being tested, that kind of thing, we destabilize people's lives. And when we destabilize people's lives, they are more likely to become desperate and to become involved in the very activity that we don't want people to engage in. So we want people to be healthy, happy, be able to do the things, get housing, have the careers they want, get licenses. So this will really be helpful for that. There's really only one area where I have a public safety concern, and that's with driving and using. But there's nothing about this bill that changes that. It has always historically been illegal to drive while you were under the influence, whether that's cannabis, alcohol, any other drug. And so I have personal experience in this back in January. I think it was actually on my birthday. I got rear-ended by somebody who was pretty high on marijuana, which I know because he came up to my window and looked in and eventually drove away. So it was a hit and run, which just reminded me, we can't be getting in our cars while we're impaired by alcohol, cannabis, anything. So I worry a little bit, and I think it's part of an educational process that people understand. They just can't be using be under the influence or impaired and get into a car. In fact, I know we've had Mike Radmer there is a lawyer in our office who's our liaison to law enforcement. And I think he mentioned a case where a police officer said pulled somebody over who had some marijuana just sitting in the center console, but that person just didn't know that he couldn't have that there. So I think a lot of these things are really education, just understanding what we can't do and continue to understand that we can't be using while impaired or not impaired while we're driving, because that's always been dangerous and will continue to. Other than that piece of education, I think that this will have nothing but positive things in terms of public safety.
Well, speaking of concerns, as we all know, the Minneapolis Police Department is currently under a state and federal consent decree. Under these court-enforced agreements, and MPD is prohibited from utilizing certain practices with respect to policing unlawful use of marijuana. Can you speak to how these consent decrees impact how MPD can enforce marijuana laws? Also, can you speak to how that might impact how your office enforces these laws as well?
That's a great question. Thank you. First, to take a step back, the Minneapolis Police Department, as many of you know, has agreed to a court enforceable agreement, otherwise known as a consent decree, with the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. They are also in the process of working through a consent decree with the federal government. That agreement Minneapolis has agreed that the Minneapolis Police Department will not do certain things. They will not expand, this is too legally, so they won't pull you over, they won't stop you, and use the scent of marijuana to justify an additional search. So they won't be doing that. That's going to require some education, which is kind of going on right now with the Minneapolis Police Department. They will not be able to ask for consent to search. What does that mean? So if you're walking along or if you're driving and a police officer stops you or pulls you over, if that officer has a legal basis to search you, they can do that. They can do that already. They'll be able to continue to do that. But under the consent decree, They will not be able to ask you, can I search you? And that's a big deal. Many people don't know they have a right to say no, first of all. And many people who do know they can say no don't want to say no because they're concerned about the potential consequences. And these consent searches sometimes end up in drugs being found, other things being found. And so that's going to be a big change for them probably. But here's where our office comes into play. We at the Hennepin County Attorney's Office are not part of the consent decree. That's just Minneapolis and the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. So what if a Minneapolis police officer asks somebody, hey, can I search your car? And they find some drugs and they submit that case to our office. Should we charge it? Because it's still legal by the courts. It's just that MPD has been going to agree to not do certain things that are still going to be legal under the courts. Let me ask you this. So the Minneapolis Police Department is going to stop doing certain things in Minneapolis, but the sheriff and the state patrol, who also operate in Minneapolis, are not part of that agreement. So what if they pull somebody over and ask for a consent search? Is it fair that the Minneapolis Police Department can't ask for a consent search, yet the sheriff or the state patrol or some other law enforcement in Minneapolis can? So these are all big issues. And you know, if you're in Minneapolis, you can't be asked for a consent search, but if you're in Robbinsdale, you can. There's just a lot of factors here, and our office is going to have to figure out, are we enforcing the consent decree, even though we're not a party to it? And what are we doing if we choose to do that? What are we doing in terms of the sheriff, the state patrol, Robbinsdale, and not picking on Robbinsdale? It's just over the border there. So our office is going to be having some community events where we get your input on, you know, what do you think we should be doing to enforce the spirit of that consent decree? So a lot of major issues, and the consent decree, I think, will really limit what MPD does in terms of using marijuana, the scent of marijuana, to lead to other types of practices. So I think it's a great thing, and I think we have a lot to figure out.
It does sound like there's a lot to figure out. Representative Frazier, as the co-chair of the Posse Caucus and a champion of the criminal justice reform, what impact do you think the cannabis legalization would have on racial disparities in the criminal justice system? And then maybe as an attorney as well, what do you have an opinion to some of the, you know, as somebody who represents a non-Minneapolis city in the fifth, what some of these things could actually mean in actualization as things get carried out in law?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is going to be positive, and net positive for the community. I think about when I was in college back in the day, and I remember walking into a party. I went to school in a small college campus up in northern Minnesota, west central Minnesota. And I remember the first all-campus party I went to, I walked in and I saw 2 students doing drugs in the middle of the floor. I had never seen that growing up in the city of Chicago. And these students didn't look like me. And I first thing I thought to myself, I gotta get out of here. I gotta get out of here, but because if the authorities come, they're gonna grab me, right? And I wasn't even doing the drugs. And I think about changing this law and making it legal now for possession of it to a certain extent, and also for the use of this recreationally, how that changes that. And how now you won't have folks that look like me being a target when there are drugs in an area or someone is using drugs. I think that is going to be that positive impact because as I talked earlier, those collateral impacts are detrimental. I mean, it puts barriers on many of the things that some of us take for granted, but have never been in a situation like that. And Mary mentioned most of that. Getting student loans, it was mentioned that getting student loans, getting a home mortgage, getting a job. Those are things that are detrimental to the progress of any individual. And so I think that's going to be a net positive. As a lawyer, I think about this, and I think as we're progressing toward the implementation of this, I think there are going to be some challenges. I think some authorities, as we're getting used to this not being legal, are still going to probably stop folks and arrest folks and try to implement the law as it was prior to this. I think we're going to have to work through that. But at the end of the day, I think it's going to be a net positive because it's going to eliminate a policy that was totally based on racial motivation, racism, and to protect particular communities because those particular individuals were threatened by those communities and the power that they were having to organize. So I'm looking forward to moving forward, getting past the dark part of American policy in that sense.
Thank you both. Lily, now that we sort of, I think, understand the, you know, the implications in regards to the criminal justice system, many of us have started our advocacy for this because of the mass incarceration and the criminality aspect of this. But there are a lot of people, obviously, who are very excited about what this means economically for communities that have been disproportionately impacted, and what it means economically for our state, for our city, our county. And so can you walk us through what implementation would look like? What are some of the requirements for licensing, and you know, how fast are these things going to start to happen here for folks?
It's still gonna be a while before we start seeing adult use dispensaries and such open up. We have to set up the entirety of the regulatory infrastructure for it, which includes a new Office of Cannabis Management, which is a cabinet level state agency that's being set up. It's gonna have to do rulemaking, take applications for licensing, evaluate those applications, and then award the licenses. And so we're looking at probably starting to see those adult use dispensaries begin to open up in 2025. But a few things to keep in mind. So what we've done here in Minnesota, like I said, with my answer to the earlier question, we really wanted to prioritize making sure that in Minnesota we are creating economic opportunities for Minnesotans, and especially for Minnesotans that have been impacted by prohibition. What's happened in a lot of other states that have legalized is, well, they've legalized, but it's a capital intensive industry to go in, and one where you don't have federal banking, it's not really like business loans and things you can go after. A lot of states have said social equity is a priority for us, but since investments haven't been made there, oftentimes you will end up with big multi-state operators going into a new state, trying to find somebody who fits the profile of a social equity applicant. They bring them on as a partner so that they're the person who's on the application. They provide the capital, knowing full well that it's terms that the individual is not going to be able to satisfy. They get the license, that person isn't able to keep up with their end of the terms, and next go around, it's basically a multi-state operator business. We really wanted to avoid that happening in Minnesota, and so we did a few things structurally with the way we structured, the scale of business that can operate in Minnesota, but we were also very deliberate about a few other things. Some are these grant programs that Representative Frazier talked about, interest-free loans, workforce training, technical assistance, things like that. One thing that was really important for us was making sure that people who actually have criminal records, including felony records that have to do with cannabis crimes, that they are able to not just be employed in the industry, be owners in the industry. That is really a unique feature of our law that we explicitly said on your licensing application. If you, your parent, your child has been arrested or otherwise adversely impacted by the criminal justice system as a result of cannabis prohibition, you get points for that. If you can provide even a narrative description of the way the war on drugs has impacted you or your community, you receive points for that. And so that is, part when people say, well, the timeline seems so long. Part and parcel of that is just making sure that through the rulemaking and through the infrastructure that they're setting up for being able to review applications, things like that, that it's robust enough that we can make sure licenses are being awarded in a fair way. But in terms of creating economic opportunity, I think it's going to be, if we do things right, if we support our local businesses, if we make sure folks are set up to not just apply and get a license, but to be successful businesses after that, it can have incredible impacts statewide, but also, since we really are focusing on having smaller businesses, these are folks that are invested in their communities. These are folks that, are setting up these businesses, hiring their neighbors. They're, participating in the fabric of making sure that it's a safe product market, a regulated product market. So we're very excited about it. It's going to take quite a lot of work, both on the government side, on the industry side.
I know that people sometimes are impatient, but I'm glad that you all are taking the time to do things on the front end, having listened to some of the work that folks in California and Colorado had to do 3 years, 5 years later to try to make sure that the system is actually working for the people it's supposed to benefit. I'm glad that Minnesota is doing it the right way. I think for the interest of time, maybe we'll take a few questions from the audience. Let me ask this question and then we can have you write down your question. Lady, this is probably one that you might have just spoke to, but what is the actual cost to the state, I'm assuming, and the benefit of this particular law, and what is the role of this, I guess, the advocacy group that you run, and when will it be filled? Or I guess what's this new board and when will it be filled?
So we're expecting that a director for that Office of Cannabis Management will be named sometime this month, and then that will trigger that rulemaking process to start. In terms of cost benefit, I'm assuming that the question asker means cost benefit literally in dollar amount. We were very, very intentional that when we talked about legalization in this state, you did not hear any of us talk about it being a windfall for the state. This was not about like legalized hot-filled potholes. This was not about funding our state's education needs through the cannabis industry. It was about ending prohibition, creating a well-regulated marketplace that created economic opportunity, and making sure to the best of our abilities that the revenues coming in from it covers the costs of the program. So in terms of, what is it going to cost? How much revenue is it going to have? We don't really know. We have some estimates. We don't, even just guessing, figuring out what is the demand for cannabis going to be in Minnesota took some extrapolation and guesswork. There will be this agency that'll be tracking that information, so we'll know it. The latest report from Department of Revenue reported on what the tax earnings since July have been on the hemp-derived THC products. We actually think that estimate was significantly low because a lot of the businesses don't even know that they're supposed to be collecting tax. So we'll see.
You want to ask? Are you writing your question or? The other question I think was answered in the subsequent questions that I asked.
Okay, first of all, I just wanted to make a quick statement. Thank you for making sure the larger companies that are out there don't get to come in and share crop the local businesses, because that's what you've seen in other places. So thank you for the foresight and the research into that. My question is, what if, in the case of MPD, we have so many different law enforcement agencies operating in the city. What if MPD asks another agency to come in to do their drug searches? They do a stop and kind of farm that piece out. I mean, that was something that I immediately thought about as kind of a workaround to those issues with the consent decrees.
How does that actually impact you?
Yeah, so for those of you who couldn't hear, I think it was, what if MPD outsources, invites some other law enforcement agency in to do searches on drugs? Something that would be in violation of the consent decree. Probably two things. One would be the Minnesota Department of Human Rights would probably have something to say about that. It would be inviting MPD to come back into negotiations or come back into court to talk about why that wasn't a violation. But big picture, I mean, you mentioned the number of law enforcement agencies. We have, I think, about 38 or so law enforcement agencies in Hennepin County. Think about that, 38. And they each and every one of them have different policies. Since I started in January, we've been meeting monthly, more than that too, with all of our law enforcement partners in Hennepin County. Because big picture, what actually happens with drugs that might be found is kind of up to us in the county attorney's office. I mentioned that legally, the courts still say that some of what MPD will not be doing is legal, like consent searches. So it's really a policy question, and it has to be, I think, resolved in terms of conversations with all of our partners. We could develop a policy that says X, we are just not going to prosecute certain cases that result from the Y. But I think what we need to be doing and what we've already started doing is having these conversations with our law enforcement partners to say, okay, what should we be doing? And I've already said to law enforcement partners, hey, you should be talking to your constituents about what they want to see in terms of if they're in Robbinsdale, which I keep picking on, but right next to Minneapolis, what do your constituents want to see? So I think policy-wise, until the legislature tells us you are not going to prosecute a particular kind of case, or the courts are going to tell us you can't prosecute these kinds of cases when they result from X. It is policy. And to me, it's got to be in partnership with all law enforcement to try to talk about why. And I do want to say that the consent decree, the things that MPD has agreed not to do are based on data. They're based on data where they could see that these particular things created really high racial disparities and did not result in getting further guns or drugs. So they're doing these things and they did result in public safety. And I would add, created more trauma in communities of color for Black drivers who get pulled over and have to go through that trauma, and also mistrust with law enforcement to the point where sometimes people will not cooperate with law enforcement when people in the community know what's happening in terms of violent crime. So there are particular reasons that this consent decree is in place. They didn't just make this up, it's based on data. So we should be having that discussion. I remember one of the chiefs of one of our suburban police departments said to me, are you going to stop allowing us to do X? And I said, well, let's have a conversation about it. What does your data look like? Because all across the country, the data is pretty consistent about traffic stops, consent searches, that kind of thing. We need to be looking at our data. We're past the time where we're talking about anecdotes. We've got to look at the data. We've got to be working together and saying, hey, what actually really keeps us safer? What is actually resulting in contraband? So I think that partnership is really critical because it is a policy issue, and it's going to be up to all of us to sit down and move forward in a constructive way where law enforcement understands and has a voice and understands what's expected of them, and community knows what we expect law enforcement to do.
Thank you for that question. Thank you, Mary. I think this next question, some of you might have already talked about this, but I'll ask anyway. We know that there is a federal prohibition. So I'm wondering if you guys can talk about what are some of the challenges of implementation that the federal prohibition creates for the state of Minnesota.
So federal prohibition creates quite a number of industry-related challenges. They range from, banking, so you have federally insured banks. You're not gonna be able to do banking with those. So, there have been various workarounds that have been developed here in Minnesota. We have state chartered banks, credit unions that are setting up, various instruments for the cannabis industry, but that continues to be a challenge. Insurance often ends up being a challenge. One of the big ones is the tax implications, and this is something that the federal rescheduling, if the DEA agrees to do it, would help with. But if you're a cannabis business, you can't deduct your operating expenses the same way every other business can on your federal taxes. And so that becomes, an additional thing again that makes it more capital intensive and difficult to go into cannabis. And even with this recent news of Health and Human Services making the recommendation to the DEA that they reschedule cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, it helps address some of these banking type issues, some of the tax issues, but ultimately it doesn't legalize cannabis. All it does is it creates a pathway for pharmaceutical companies to be able to do research on them through the FDA's drug approval route. It doesn't do anything to make it legal. It doesn't do anything to create equitable outcomes. It doesn't do anything really to remedy past injustices. And so a lot of that obligation is going to continue to fall on states to make sure that, in fact, one of the things we're more concerned about is that rescheduling is just going to make it more difficult for us to keep those multi-state operators out of Minnesota. And so in some ways it does create some additional things that we're going to need to work with our state policymakers to ensure we're addressing.
Thank you, Lady. And this is probably it. We'll end with this question, and I'll close it to Representative Frazier. You all are going back in a session. I don't know whether there'll be a special session or you wait till next year. But I know there's been some talk about some things that might still be left to do on marijuana policy. Can you talk about some of those things, please?
I can't definitively say whether or not we're going to go. We'll be headed back to a special session. There's been some conversation recently about that, particularly dealing with the situation with our school resource officers, new language that passed last session. Many of us think we can resolve that issue without going back to special session. So right now, I can't say definitively if we will or not. But what I will say for most of us that if we do go back into a special session, we will take the opportunity to resolve some issues that we need to resolve, whether it be about cannabis, or there's some other issues that we have to fix that were in our tax bill. There's also some issues that we have to fix in some of the other major criminal justice reform laws we put in place. There are some technical fixes, but nonetheless need to be addressed by legislation. We go back into the next session. But right now, I can't definitively say whether or not we're going to head into a special session. So it may be we just have to wait until February to get things done.
Wonderful. With that,
I can add
she's got some things left.
one thing that's relevant to the topic. I mean, as someone who works on the advocacy side of this, when we come back next legislative session, this was an enormous bill. This was a 300 some odd page bill. It had to go through, over a dozen committees in each chamber. And in a year where the legislature was pushing a very ambitious agenda, some things did not get done. And by and large on the cannabis stuff, the things that did not get done really pertain to the criminal justice elements of it. What we're gearing up for going into the next legislative session, I think, we're hoping that we can have some kind of comprehensive cannabis criminal justice reform bill. I, for one, I would like to see possession crimes entirely eliminated when we look across states that have legalized. If you continue to have possession crimes, regardless of what the threshold is, they are imposed disparately. They just are. We also, this was something we tried to get done, we ran out of time, getting rid of, the smell of fresh and burnt cannabis as being presumptive reasons, for a stop, for a search. And then, there's local control related issues. We, of course, always want to be respectful of the ability of local governments to have local control, but what we're beginning to see, and as soon as I'm done here, I'm headed over to St. Paul, where they're going to be hearing a proposed ordinance that would ban any public smoking and vaping of cannabis. Well, the state law makes it so that you can't consume cannabis in any multi-family housing. So if you're a renter, you're more likely to be, somebody with lower income, you're more likely to be a person of color, and now you can't smoke or vape cannabis in your home. You can't do it in a vehicle, and now you can't do it anywhere outside in public. Our concern is we're setting up the next generation of lurking and spitting laws. And so these are things that we're beginning to see kind of pop up all over the state. We want to make sure we're really being thoughtful and addressing these things comprehensively at a state level.
Well, wonderful. I'm sure we'll all be following along, both in some of the technical fixes that might or might not happen in a special session, or in the next session, or some of the things that we might see some of the municipalities try out, and some of the really creative ways. I think that your office, in the county office, decides, the county attorney's office decides to go through about some of this stuff. But with that, we're just really honored to have all of you join us. Thank you so much, and I look forward to us having further conversations as this piece of legislation gets fully implemented and the benefits of it are noticed by the constituents we all serve.